Hello, students. In this session, we are going to talk about occupation and resistance. And we'll take a look at some of the experiences of people after the aftermath of the U.S.-Mexico War. Now, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, as we've learned, brought war to an end, and it established the political boundary known as the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, through it, a huge region that was formerly Mexico now became the United States. Now, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and California now became the property of the United States. Now, the most noteworthy articles that was emphasized before concerned the protection of land grants and cultural rights of both Mexicans and Indians or Native Americans living in the region that the United States now comes to occupy. Now, the treaty protected land grants and tenure rights that were established during the Spanish and Mexican periods. And the treaty guaranteed land titles would be respected in the areas that became known as Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and California. Now, cultural customs were to be given equal consideration, and Mexicans and Native peoples were not to be discriminated against as they took up citizenship in the new country. So the border that was created from this treaty now turned the Mexican migration experience into immigration. Mexicans from now on were to immigrate to their occupied territory. Now, over 80,000 Mexicans and close to 1 million Native peoples that stayed on the land experienced discrimination and segregation. They will experience the racialization process, and this is what we need to pay attention to. Many will lose their land, and the U.S. will put up obstacles for them to achieve citizenship. And as we have heard before in the documentary, the U.S. does not claim them as members of the community, and Mexico has lost sight of them. So the treaty allowed for the protection of land grants and cultural rights and citizenship. And the United States will violate the citizenship equality and will initiate the process of racialization. Mexicans, especially those of color, received inferior civil rights. Mestizos, Christianized Indians, Afro-mestizos came under different racial laws. White Mexicans, however, could gain full citizenship. States and territories are going to be given the right to determine Mexicans' citizenship status. Now, with regards to Native peoples, we must appreciate that both Mexico and the United States expansion is dependent upon access to land. So consequently, both countries have a history of displacing Native societies to allow its citizens opportunity to succeed. So when reviewing U.S.-Mexico international relations, treaties that were entered into prior to and after the war are going to set guidelines for Native removal. As you have learned, one of the reasons why Mexico opened up Texas to American colonists was that Native peoples were numerically and militarily strong, and they resisted the takeover of their lands. And we're looking at the economic expansion of two recently independent nations, Mexico and the United States. Success as nations is dependent upon the availability of land, followed by the eventual displacement of Native peoples by colonists. In fact, the Texas Rebellion notwithstanding, initial agreements between Mexico and the United States emphasized protection of property and the maintenance of mercantile trade along the border at the expense of Native rights. The first treaty entered into by both countries specifically called for the quote-unquote restrainment by force of all Native nations living within the boundaries of each country, while state and national measures of both countries attempted to integrate Native peoples and then confiscate their land holdings for advancing settlers. International relations between Mexico and the United States set the guidelines for Native removal and the enhancement of economic growth along the border. So when Mexico had just gained its independence, and during this national period here in the Southwest between 1821 to 1846, the northern frontier of Mexico experienced rapid change both economically and demographically. Pre-capitalist village economies gave way to mercantile capitalism. trade networks increased significantly, and the flow of business capital allowed the Mexican elite and their American counterparts to develop an entrepreneurial class along the upper and lower portions of the Rio Grande and in California. However, the increasing importance of the trade and the arrival of Mexican and American settlers into the region disrupted the lifestyles of numerous native nations. So their only defense to game depletion and land encroachments became more raids. When you take a look at the 1832 Treaty of Commerce entered into by both the United States and Mexico, it shares the concern of protection of commerce from quote-unquote marauding native groups. Both the Mexican and U.S. government desire to protect their merchants from Indian depredations, and that's the term that they will be using in their treaties now, Indian depredations. In other words, Indian resistance to the occupation of their lands from both Mexico and the United States. So here in this treaty, if you could bring it up full force on April 5th, 1832, in this treaty of amity, commerce, and navigation, you could read that it is likewise agreed that the two contracting parties shall by all means in their power maintain peace and harmony among the several Indian nations who inhabit the lands adjacent to the lines and rivers which form the boundaries of the two countries, and the better to obtain this object, both parties themselves to restrain by force all hostilities and incursions on the part of Indian nations living within their respective boundaries, so that the United States of America will not suffer their Indians to attack the citizens of the United Mexican States, nor will the United Mexican States permit the Indians residing within their territories to commit hostilities against the citizens of the United States of America, nor against the Indians residing within the limits of the United States in any manner whatever. So here in this treaty, April 5th of 1832, an agreement was proclaimed. Unfortunately, this agreement and other state policies adopted by both countries only harassed the native situation. The result was an increase in hostilities on both sides, Mexicans against native peoples, Americans against native peoples. Now, despite the favorable terms of citizenship that Mexico insisted that the U.S. should extend to native societies from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, no such privilege was granted native peoples. The U.S. had established a militarized removal policy, and all native peoples were subject to its directives. In fact, the U.S., after the war, proudly proclaimed itself the border vigilante when dealing with native peoples who resisted the occupation of their territories, regardless of the border that was created. Now, the prevailing notion after the war was that both Mexican and American settlers and settlements needed protection from quote-unquote roving hostiles. Article 11, as I put up here, even though I just went ahead and put it up on the board, I don't expect you to read it all, but Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, just so you can understand, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they were very much aware, both countries were aware that they're coming in to occupy native lands. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo allowed the Secretary of State Buchanan to proudly proclaim that the United States, in his word, possessed both the will and the ability to restrain the Indians. Now, the Holocaust that native peoples are going to face, California in the 1850s, in Arizona, the longest walk endured by the Navajo, the subjugation of the Comanche in Texas, and the massacre at Sand Creek in Colorado are testaments to U.S. Policy towards native peoples. And this article just shares the significance of both countries and their settler patterns, colonial settler patterns. Now, even though Article 8 of the treaty protected the property of those in the occupied territory, the U.S. Congress is going to deny native peoples citizenship, hence, without citizenship, property rights. Now, when the Homestead Act of 1862 passed, it allowed white settlers to claim 162 acres of public land. Land that was not colonized by Mexicans and property that was and property held by native peoples are going to be declared public. Now, the act enabled the federal government to populate the Southwest with white settlers. All states discriminated against native-born Mexicans and all non-white Mexicans. all states nullified African descent people from claiming land. Now, under U.S. rule, Native people became distinct from Mexicans. Communities which the government classified as quote-unquote Indian under the treaty were exempt from federal laws applied to quote-unquote wild Indians. Again, roving hostiles. States and territories would determine the status of Native people. If they were part of the population declared as citizens of Mexico, then treaty rights would be adjudicated in court. And if Native peoples were determined to be quote-unquote nomadic or nomadic groups, then they fell under the federal program of removal. Now let's take a look at what happened to the Navajo and Mescalero Apache in New Mexico and Arizona.
All Native peoples that you can speak of had their Trail of Tears in terms of being removed in the face of white expansion.
General Stephen Watts Kearny and the Army of the West was dispatched to take Mexican territories in 1846. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War in 1848. The United States now controlled vast tracts of new land, some 1.2 million square miles. The Navajo homeland was considered United States territory. General Kearny wrote, "The United States would protect the persons and property of all quiet and peaceful inhabitants within its boundaries against their enemies, the Utahs, Navajos, and others."
We were not citizens of the United States at that time. We were considered as enemy. So to do whatever they want to with us.
The Dene saw their homeland as sacred.
The Anglos and the Hispanos actually saw themselves as the victims of this massive wave of Navajo raiding in the 1850s and believed that they were the ones that had to be protected. The United States Army was not going to wage war on its own people, including the Hispanos, who were made citizens at the end of the Mexican-American War.
They went out and the people were out and raiding, and also the Mexican do the same thing too. So that's where it started.
Fort Defiance was constructed in the southern part of the Navajo homeland in 1851. Tension escalated. The United States was in the midst of civil war in the early 1860s. General James Henry Carleton was named military commander of New Mexico in the summer of 1862.
James Henry Carleton was a brilliant man. He was a civilian appointment to the United States Army in 1839. He had, prior to that, pursued a literary career in Boston.
General Carleton believed a military campaign against the Navajo was necessary. Carleton wanted the famous mountain man and frontiersman Christopher Kit Carson to lead the effort. Kit Carson was now a colonel with the New Mexico Volunteers. Kit Carson was 53 years old in 1862. Carson was living with his third wife Josefa and their family in Taos. Kit Carson followed his trend of obeying powerful, charismatic men. General Carleton and his soldiers twice explored an area along the Pecos River in the early 1850s. It was near the Texas border in southeast New Mexico. Carleton envisioned this place as a reservation for Navajos. It was called Bosque Redondo. Stark plains surround a tree-lined river.
If the Indians in the American West were not put on reservations, they would be exterminated, federal policymakers believed. The reservation was considered a way of protecting the American Indians from extinction.
General Carleton created Fort Sumner on the Pecos River in 1862. It was named for General Edwin Sumner, the former commander of the Department of New Mexico. General Carleton wanted Navajos moved to Bosque Redondo. He believed Navajos could live like Pueblos as pastoral farmers.
Another motivation that Carleton had for rounding up the Navajo and moving them was his belief, based on no particular evidence, that Navajo country was rich in gold.
General Carleton also wanted Mescalero Apaches brought to the Bosque Redondo reservation. Carleton ordered a shoot-to-kill policy in 1862. Carleton ordered Kit Carson to kill all Mescalero men, wherever and whenever you can find them. The women and children will not be harmed, but you will take them prisoners. Kit Carson and his soldiers captured much of the Mescalero Apache tribe. About 400 men, women, and children were brought to Bosque Redondo.
Our people were
Okay, so let's appreciate the fact that despite the favorable terms of citizenship that Mexico insisted the U.S. should extend to native societies, no such privilege was granted. And when we take a look at Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico is being duplicitous here by emphasizing and allowing the United States to emphasize that they would go ahead and become or restrain native resistance movements. So the Holocaust Native peoples faced in the Southwest, in California in the 1850s, and the long walk that was endured by the Navajo in Arizona and the Mescalero Apache in New Mexico, the subjugation of the Comanche in Texas, and one of the most important massacres that occurred in Colorado, the Sand Creek Massacre. These are testaments to U.S. policy towards Native peoples. And so there's no way that the idea behind the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in terms of protecting Native peoples was ever going to be fulfilled. This concludes the first segment of U.S. occupation of Mexico, the Treaty of Native Peoples.